Before I begin talking about some analysis of what actually took place versus what we were told was taking place, I want to give you a bit of background about the Gaza Strip. If you look at a map of the Gaza Strip, it's basically, the strip indicates it's a very small piece of land. It's basically about 24 miles long by something like 2.4 miles wide. It's a very small strip of land. Relative to the size of all of Palestine, if you consider all of Palestine, which means present-day Israel and the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, if you take into consideration that land area, it's actually 1% of the total land area of Palestine. That's what we're talking about. What we're also talking about is that in that piece of land, which is 1% of the total land area of Palestine, there live 1.5 million Palestinians. 1.5 million Palestinians, of whom 1.1 million are refugees. Okay? 1.5 million Palestinians live in this piece of land, which makes it actually, before I tell you where the refugees came from, which makes it the most densely populated place on this planet. If you look at the population density of the Gaza Strip, the population density of the Gaza Strip is about slightly over 6,000 people living per square kilometer. Okay, a kilometer is roughly half a mile, right? So we're talking about 12,000 people per mile, per square mile, living in the Gaza Strip. In places, there are 8 refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. One of them, which you may have heard in the news recently, was Jabalia refugee camp, which is located in the northern section of the Gaza Strip. And this refugee camp has 100,000 people living in 1.4 square kilometers. It is the most densely populated spot almost on the planet. 1.4 square kilometers, 100,000 people live in that place. So naturally, if you have a bombardment of a Jabalia refugee camp, which is what happened in the recent Israeli bombardment by air, land, and sea, you're going to hit civilians. You cannot miss civilian infrastructure. That's the nature of Gaza. Okay? It's a very densely populated, full of civilian, densely packed population center. I said 1.1 million of the 1.5 million Palestinians living there, that's roughly 75% of the population are refugees. And they're refugees because in 1948, when Israel was imposed on Palestine, and it was created in Palestine, there was a series of massacres that were committed as part of a plan that the Zionists who were occupying Palestine, taking over Palestine, that they instituted this series of massacres as part of Plan Dalet, which they call Plan Dalet. Dalet in Hebrew means D, the letter D. So it was Plan D. And so what they did was they committed a series of massacres all across Palestine with the intention that these massacres in various villages and towns would drive the population out of the land. Why? Because they wanted to establish in Palestine an exclusive Jewish state. Right? You always hear about the Jewish state, correct? The plan, therefore, was how can you create a Jewish state if you have an indigenous population that's not Jewish? And so the only way you can do that, in fact, is either by forcing the people to leave, or killing them, or both, right? There's no other ways you can empty the land of its indigenous inhabitants. And so what they did was actually they committed a series of massacres. For example, Benny Morris, who's a Zionist actually, who believes in this exclusive Jewish state, documented something like 33 massacres that took place in Palestine in the 1948 era, 60 years ago. And others like Saleh Abdel Jawad from Birzeit University documented something like 55 massacres that were committed in 1948, all across, all in different places in Palestine, with the intention of driving the people out. So, in southern Palestine, in places like, you've heard of the name Shderot, right? Where the missiles, or supposedly Hamas super missiles were hitting. Shderot was actually a town called Najd. Before 1948, it was a Palestinian town called Najd, where most of its residents were actually kicked out in 1948, and they ended up in the Gaza Strip. So Najd was renamed Shderot, and settlers from all over Europe, largely, were placed in their place, on their land. Other places where the population of Gaza largely came from were towns like Bir al-Saba, which is in the north, further north, towns like Ascalon, they call it Ashkelon, Ashdod. They named a town called Kiryat Gat. Kiryat Gat actually sits on the site of two villages, whose names might sound familiar to you actually, Fallujah and Iraq al-Manshiyah. And these are not in Iraq, these are actually in Palestine, in the southern tip of Palestine. And in 1949, actually, after the armistice agreement of 1949, the inhabitants of Fallujah and Iraq al-Manshiyah were kicked out into Gaza, and they destroyed their homes, they built a town on top of it, which they called Kiryat Gat. And Kiryat Gat is where Intel Corporation, for example, has a big plant on stolen Arab land. And so that's where a lot of those refugees, on their land, that's where a lot of the refugees ended up why they ended up in the Gaza Strip. Of that population, as I said, 1.1 million out of 1.5 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are refugees. And they have been denied, in fact, by the state of Israel, their right to return to their homes. It's actually not a special right that Palestinians seek, it's a right that we seek, but it's not a special right. It's a right that's recognized in international law. It's a right that's actually codified, for example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 13, which states that everybody has the right to leave and to return to their home. And it's also was reaffirmed, in fact, the day after the Universal Declaration was adopted by the United Nations in 1948, on the 10th of December, the 11th of December, the United Nations passed Resolution 194, which reaffirmed that Palestinians, like everybody else, have the right to return to their homes. But this right, and actually this is 60 years ago, right? But since that time, that United Nations resolution has been reaffirmed 135 times. Actually, over 135 times. And Israel has refused to implement this, and the only other country that has agreed with Israel is, guess who?
U.S.
The U.S. The only other country that in the world that has consistently agreed with the U.S., with Israel is the U.S., other than the first year, by the way, because Resolution 194 was actually actively supported by the U.S. in 1948. But since then, it has retracted its support for this resolution. So, in the Gaza Strip, We have 1.5 million people, 1.1 million who are denied their right to return to their homes and lands in places in the south of Palestine, like Sderot. And I think that's important to remember that Sderot was actually Najd. It's important to remember that Kiryat Gat was al-Fallujah and the Iraq al-Manshiyya, and that Intel has a plant built on stolen land. And I think it's important to know that this whole region where those Palestinians came from, the population density, remember I told you the population density in the Gaza Strip is about 6,000 or more than 6,000 people per square kilometer. You know how much it is across the barbed wire, across the Eretz checkpoint? It's 6 people per square kilometer. 6,000, 6. So half their land is actually empty. Okay?